especially delighted to welcome all of you here on behalf of the Faculty of Arts. That is, the feedback is astonishing. What was that? Oh, okay. Oh, it's not feedback. All right. It's just, it has a funny feel up here, so I apologize in advance. So as I say, welcome on behalf of the Faculty of Arts. Welcome to the Faculty Club. Welcome to the University of Alberta. And especially welcome to our guest speaker, Donna Haraway, and to the think tank participants who've come from all the different parts of the country to be here. I hope you have enjoyed your time in Edmonton, and I would say it's never this cold, but I know that would be a lie. But our hearts are warm, so there we are. I have to tell you that I'm organizing a meeting next week of people from across Canada, and they all said, ooh, March in Edmonton, it'll be very cold. And I said, it's okay, we actually have central heating. So when I look around the room, I see many familiar faces, both from across the faculty and from other parts of campus. And I'll stand here for a second. Tell me when to start again. Yeah, it's just off now, yes. Am I mic'd again? Excellent, excellent. So this is the challenge of using unusual spaces, and there's something very exciting about using unusual spaces like the Faculty Club for this kind of event. But it does mean that we have to think differently about how we are using them. As I started to One of the things that I often say about interdisciplinarity is that the first thing you need to bring to the table is generosity, because it's so easy to think that people from other disciplines are just stupid. And that's not true. So you have to start by recognizing that they are as smart as you are, and if you can't understand them, they probably can't understand you either. So as interdisciplinarians, we have to listen actively and generously and work hard to forge those really important links that will make the work we do richer and completely different than we could have imagined. This is one of the reasons that we established the Cool Institute for Advanced Study, KIAS as we like to call it, in 2010. You can see its banner behind me. With the first decade of the 21st century now behind us, it seemed increasingly apparent that the only way to face the critical challenges that lay ahead were through collaboration and to a dedication to shared ideals across disciplines and knowledge bases. We wanted to create an intellectual environment where bold, collaborative endeavors could be supported and pursued. And the Research Creation Working Group, which is funded by KIAS, is one such endeavor. It's already, as those of you in the room know, has already brought together researchers from all three areas of our faculty, fine arts, humanities, and social sciences, as well as from other areas on campus, secondary education, physical education and recreation, human ecology, to explore questions surrounding the intersection of art and research. And of course, it's brought us here tonight to hear this fascinating lecture, as I know it will be. I want to thank Natalie Lovelace and the Research Creation Working Group for inviting Dr. Haraway here and creating this unique opportunity for us to come together. I'd also like to thank Dr. Haraway for being our honored guest, and I look forward very much to hearing your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Cormack. And welcome everybody to Donna Haraway's keynote lecture for, as you've heard, the Research Creation Working Group's 2014 think tank, Knowings and Knots, Methodologies and Ecologies in Research Creation. Move forward to your slide. Before opening up to Dr. Haraway, and I'm going to do this quickly because I know this is what we're here for, I have a few acknowledgements I'd like to make. The first acknowledgement is to the nations of Treaty 6, especially the Papas-Chase people, and also the Blackfoot and the Métis nations whose territory this is. To take time to do so, to make such an acknowledgement, in a context like this, is a serious gesture that seems to me to be necessary to any gathering attentive to what it takes to, in Dr. Haraway's idiom, stay with the troubles. In this case, the ongoing legacy of colonial violence, marked most immediately here in Edmonton by next week's Truth and Reconciliation Commission being held at the Shaw Conference Centre from Wednesday through to Sunday. There are a number of other acknowledgements I'd like to make that are both formal and dear to my heart. I'd like to thank Jeffrey Rockwell, the director of the Cool Institute for Advanced Studies that we just heard about, and Oliver Rossier. Oliver, where are you? Oliver's hiding. So both Jeffrey and Oliver. Oliver is the Cool Institute's administrative coordinator. I'd like to thank both of them for their vision and support, without which none of this would be possible. And for those, you've all heard about the Cool Institute, but if you want to hear about their new funding structure that was just approved, please do find Jeffrey or Oliver when we find him. Jeffrey is right here, during the reception that follows this, and bend their ear and ask them about what's going on, because it's really, really very exciting. So who's next? So if anyone, so that's, okay, great. So that part done. There are others too who have been key in supporting this event through either funds or in-kind support. I won't take the time to name all of them in detail, but in short, I'd like to thank the Killam Research Fund, the University of Alberta's Faculty of Arts, the Shirk Situating Science Cluster and Dr. Robert Smith in particular, the CRC in Cultural Studies, the CRC in Design Studies, the CRC in Philosophy of Gender and Sexuality, and Edmonton's Latitude 53 Contemporary Art Space, and the Departments of Art and Design and Women and Gender Studies, all here at the University of Alberta. Finally, I'd like to thank all the incredible volunteers from my Debates in Art and Research seminar, from the Research Creation Working Group, and all the others who've been involved in making this entire event happen, which we're halfway through and has been just so dear to my heart. Amazing. Especially Catherine Clune-Taylor. Catherine, where are you? Catherine Clune-Taylor. Emily Saint-Hilaire. Emily, where are you? Hi. Emily. Michael Woolley, where are you? Michael. And Jacques Talbot. Jacques, back there. I'd like to thank all of you for taking lead on certain parts of this and really saving my ass. So thank you. Okay. So with that said, I'm honored and thrilled to introduce Dr. Donna Haraway and formally welcome her to Edmonton and to the U of A for the first time, and hopefully not the last. Dr. Haraway earned her PhD in biology at Yale University in 1972 and has taught in the history of science, science and technology studies, and feminist theory at the University of Hawaii, Johns Hopkins University, and since 1980 at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she is Distinguished Professor Emerita in the History of Consciousness Department. She's been the principal advisor for over 60 doctoral students, of which I count myself blessed to have been one, and has served as committee member for many more across North America, Europe, and Australia, sewing her particular brand of feminist theory practice into a dense web whose repercussions continue to reverberate across disciplines, politics, and continents. In the year 2000, she was awarded the J.D. Bernal Prize, which is the Society for Social Studies of Science's highest honor for distinguished lifetime contributions to the field. Haraway's most recent books, The Companion Species Manifesto from 2003 and When Species Meet from 2008, enact, on my reading, her germinal model of situated knowledges, which she coined in 1998, and rework it through the perspective of companion species, of which we will no doubt hear more of today. We in the Research Creation Working Group are particularly excited to have Dr. Haraway here, as such a perspective has particular relevance for the politics and the pedagogy, as well as the critical and emergent discourses of research creation as they attempt to negotiate contemporary pedagogical divides between the arts, social sciences, and humanities. So thank you very much, Dr. Haraway, for being here. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Donna Haraway.
Do you have any idea what a privilege it is to work with graduate students like Natalie and like Shalabar and the other folks who have fed me now for about 40 years? It's really an extraordinary experience. Let me ask something about sound quality. Are we reverberating in really intolerable ways, or are things going well enough? Okay, I discovered actually in the last 2 hours the central question of my keynote talk. As I was putting together the notes and trying to imagine how to make it live, there was a sentence that was buried in the encounter with one of the slides that I think I want to bring to the front. And it is, what happens when human exceptionalism and methodological individualism, as philosophical research commitments across the disciplines in the Euro-infused knowledge projects, what happens when human exceptionalism and methodological individualism and their stories become literally unthinkable in the best scientific practices of our day? And I would maintain and hope to convince you, if you aren't already, that indeed methodological individualism and human exceptionalism are practically unthinkable across the transdisciplinary natural and engineering sciences, the human sciences and arts. And I would like to say something about what I think the consequences might be for imagining and helping to make happen more livable presents as well as more livable futures. Now, first let me introduce us to a little bit of initial terminology that's in the title. Staying with the trouble is truly my effort in a multi-species way to remain alive and non-cynical, non-skeptical, non-defeated, but also not in denial about the level of destruction which we inherit and hold in our hands whether we want to or not. That the pattern is truly in our hands whether we asked for it or not. And the possibility of flourishing on this earth is truly at stake. And the temptations to cynicism or defeatism, to despair, to various forms of avoidance and denial are extreme. My view is that it is not possible to stay with the trouble among us without the practice of joy. That the practices of joyful collective and individual pleasure are essential to the arts of living on a damaged planet. Now, symbiosis is a term that I got from a Master of Arts student in Australia who was studying evolutionary studies and wrote a dissertation called A Self-Organizing Systems Perspective on Planning for Sustainability, in which she proposed that symbiosis was a much better term than autopoiesis for understanding the complexities of formative processes that make the earth and just about everything on it. She defines symbiosis in this way. Sympoetic, that is, collectively producing systems, sim, linked with, sympoetic systems. Poiesis in Greek, as a quick reminder, means making. Okay. Symbiosis systems do not have self-defined spatial or temporal boundaries. Information and control are distributed among components. The systems are evolutionary and have the potential for surprising change. Since they cannot be identified by boundaries, symbiotic systems must be identified by the self-organizing factors involved in their ongoing and layered and palimpsestic generations. I added a few adjectives. Okay. This is Mary Beth Dempster writing a master's thesis in 1998. String figures are games that I have taken up as figures of practice thinking, figures of making, doing, thinking, ways of engaging with each other in passing patterns that are at risk back and forth. We'll hear more about those as the lecture goes on. And multi-species muddles are alarmingly self-explanatory. Okay. Now, I consider myself a creature of the mud, not the sky. And muddle, is an old Dutch word for not clarified, in the mud, obscure. And I'm interested in the powers of terra, the powers of the earth, the abyssal and elemental powers before they were astralized in Mesopotamia, in Greece, in Egypt, before the production of the pantheons of the gods with tame committees of dependent gods. I'm much more interested in the abyssal and elemental forces that were named by the Greeks things like chaos, but which I believe are much more interesting, both in their generative and their destructive powers, and indeed are ongoing, and will no more sort into that was back then and now we're in the Anthropocene or the Australocene or the Futurocene, into the traditional and the modern, the past and the future. The abyssal and elemental powers won't sort that way. Their temporalities work otherwise. And I've put 3 words on this little whiteboard, which of course nobody can see, but I will say them because they will be recurring throughout this lecture constantly. The Anthropocene, which we will hear more about, has been proposed by the Anthropocene Working Group of the Geological Society of America for naming the current epoch of life on Earth because it is written into the sedimentary layers on the rocks, the chemistry of the ocean, the chemistry of the atmospheres, a very thin layer of profound change, sometimes called the Earth's 6th great extinction event, written into the tissues of the planet, deserve a name. Anthropocene has been proposed as that name. We'll talk more about it. A name which I think is patently better is Capitalocene, since the Anthropocene is in fact premised on the exploitation of fossil fuels. That is a story of the formations of modern systems of commerce, capital, financialization, production and extraction of vast amounts of wealth on the fund of carbon. And then finally, my abyssal and elemental powers, the Thulocene. Some of you are science fiction readers and remember H.P. Lovecraft, Thulu. Forget immediately, except for remembering the word, which he misspelled, thank goodness, which allows me to reappropriate it. He left the H out. Thulocene, I am spelling correctly, as C-H-T-H-U-L-U-R-O, I don't know, C-E-N-E. Thulocene. Okay. Lovecraft wanted these to be the abyssal, tentacled, deadly monster forces that threaten mankind from the abyss. And I think a feminist Thulu is doing something quite different that I will propose further as we go on. Now, did something happen here? There's a patron saint for this lecture. And she is a spider named Pimoa Tulu, also misspelled because it was named after Lovecraft. Sorry about that. Pimoa Tulu's, the name Pimoa comes from the Gashut Nation, the Gashut Native American peoples of Utah, and it means the leggy one, the long-legged. And Thulu of the earth, under the earth, from the bottoms of the abyss, under the sea, under the earth, that which comes from below rather than from above. The leggy one that comes from below and hangs up upside down in a particular set of niches that happen to be on redwood stumps in only a few places on Earth in Mendocino County and Sonoma County in California, which is where I happen to live much of my life, so that they are in place, connected to some things, not everything, but named in this astonishing chimeric way between the Goshute language of Utah and a kind of anglicized Greek for a California spider that has a very narrow range of tolerances, gives me, I think, a workable sense of place for a lecture like this. She also says something to me about what, not just the symbiosis with which I introduced this lecture, but also symphonic, not just phonic, but symphonic. No more autopoiesis, but symbiosis, not simply phonic, but symphonic kinds of processes are of interest to me. SF is my sign. Some people think it means science fiction, and of course it does, or string figures, or science fact, or speculative fabulation, or speculative feminism, or, since I gave this lecture at CRC in France last summer, soins de ficelle emerged, or so far. Okay? Now, the painting that's behind my, my little epistemological logo, my little SF sign under which I work, is a painting by Baila Goldenthal that some of you might recognize, her Cat's Cradle series that she did over a period in the 1990s. That I have found both very beautiful and very suggestive of how I experience scholarship. I am under the thrall of certain thinkers. For example, if I will find my notes, I will remember who they are. Okay, Marilyn Strathern, the anthropologist whose initial fieldwork was done among the Hagen in Papua New Guinea, on Mount Hagen in Papua New Guinea, has for years argued that anthropology is that undertaking that studies relations with relations, that takes the risk of relentless contingency in knowledge projects by always making some thoughts think other thoughts. So she's the one who teaches me that it matters what thoughts think thoughts, what knowledges know knowledges, what relations relate relations, what worlds. It matters what stories tell stories. So that holding some stories still in order to tell another story in its frame, and then to be mobile, to be willing to flip, to do a kind of systems flip between story cycles or story forms, to not hold one set of stories to normalize all the others. Perhaps the most obvious example of the way one set of stories normalizes all the others I could bring out of the George W. Bush administration, where a particular story of democracy normalized all stories of trade and power. All stories of trade and power had to be somehow translated by force, if necessary, into a particular lived world of free trade and democratic process of a particular kind of for lack of a better word, neoliberal or neoliberal form. The way those stories normalize others. But surely in the history of philosophy and science and most of our disciplines, the great Greek and Roman stories have normalized all others. And others are brought in as examples, or alternatives, or enrichments, or examples of conquest, or perhaps something better than what we've got, but are rarely brought in as fully fledged cognitive symbiotic systems for thinking, making, doing, with which to renormalize other stories. That it matters what stories. It matters what thoughts think thoughts. And learning how to do that is part of the struggle, I think, for survival. Isabelle Stengers has taught me the wonder and lure of abstraction. She's a philosopher in the mode of Deleuze and Whitehead, process philosopher, feminist, purely crazy woman, who with Philippe Pignard wrote Capitalist Sorcery, who with Vincent Desprez writes about disobedient women, who has explained to me in exquisite technical detail the way abstraction works as a lure, as that to which one is drawn in a movement, a pressure, an affective pressure of desire. That abstractions are those things which lure us for holding together the components of a question, of a problem, of a world. And that abstractions break. The care and fitting of abstraction is an art. Far from being those things which alienate and objectify, abstractions are those things which lure for their promise of a fragile and mortal coherence. Okay? And then it's in their breaking that the desire for other abstractions, for abstractions that might work otherwise or do something else, is born and activated. Hannah Arendt is another thinker I'm thinking with in this talk. In particular, I'm looking for her understanding of the importance of thinking, okay? And the tragic wounding to the earth to live lives that are not thought. The banality of evil, in Hannah Arendt's terms, when she referred to Eichmann, turned on his inability to live the consequences of his life, and that in turn turned on his inability to think his life, that he truly could not cognitively, affectively live inside the consequences and practices of his own actions. He was a talented technocrat, perfectly good at all sorts of functional reason, perfectly good at disciplinary work in his situated job of killing efficiently. But even if our job is not killing efficiently, too many of us lead lives that are not thought. And I think Hannah Arendt is critical to bring back into the conversation in that way. I'm also thinking with, in this talk, Tim Ingold, another anthropologist, whose beautiful little book called Lines ethnographically describes the extraordinary diversity of kinds and motions of lines, but who argues, for my purposes, that all creatures are interwoven wayfarers, and that traces and lines of dwelling and travel. Jim Clifford, my colleague, always talks about dwelling and traveling. Roots and Routes is the title of one of his books. These things come together for me. By the way, the backdrop of this geste speculatif is another painting by Violet Goldenthal. I'm in the process of working with her daughter on the right to use them, though I've been using them for a couple of years. In any case, copyrights are in process, and her daughter is really nice. Okay. We move on then perhaps to my, the thinker who I probably spend the most time with, which is Ursula Le Guin. And Charles Barr, who was Natalie's husband in taking care of a Gale 5 force hurricane named Orion at this moment, and therefore is not at this talk. Shaw is one of the people who taught me how to read Always Coming Home, one of Ursula Le Guin's most complicated books. Here I have on the cover another of her books, which is The Word for World is Forest, in which at the end of a colonial encounter, very similar to the plot of the movie Avatar, okay, the colonists have been kicked off. The extractors, the great mega extractors, are being kicked off planet after a successful revolt of the indigenous peoples of this world. There is a conversation. Two things happen that are different from Avatar that are important for my purposes today. One of them is that the chief murderer, the chief technocrat, autocrat in charge of the killing machines, is condemned to live, not to die, and to remain on the planet, to live on an island in isolation, to live the world he created, to live out the consequences of his actions. That's the first thing. And the second is when the Aboriginal people speaking to the Ecumen, saying, well, now you can go back to life as usual, having conducted this war. And the speaker says, what kind of imagination do you have? We can no longer pretend that we no longer, that we do not know how to kill one another, not just you. Okay? That the knowledge of knowing how to kill one another is the kind of thing that we must come to terms with. Now, Ursula Le Guin, many years ago now already, 20 years ago, wrote a very short story, a very short essay, called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. in which she argued for the slight negative space that could contain something, in which she argues for the container as that which makes us who we are. The bottle, the net, the shell, the clay pot, that which can contain something to be given to another, is the invention that produces the possibility of a life worth living, to go back really to my debts to Hannah Arendt. And Ursula Le Guin is constantly thinking in multi-species ways when she does this. What is it to join with another in an SF game, to somehow create the negative spaces that can actually hold something that can then be given? Or as Isabelle Stengers put it, what is it to hold still enough in a string figure game so that the pattern can be taken up and altered and passed on? And like it or not, then the pattern is in one's hands, and something must be done with it. Okay. I want to go now to this moment, this historical conjuncture in Stuart Hall's, wait, not ready yet. One other thinker you need. Sorry about that. Tom Van Doren, absolutely you need Tom Van Doren, because you need his Flightways, Life and Loss at the Edge of Extinction. This is a young philosopher, anthropologist, environmentalist, who asks in that book what it means to hold open space for another. And he examines in ethnographic detail the multi-species work of species survival plans. And he's interested in the question of labor and whose labor keeps who alive, whose labor keeps whom alive. And in my favorite chapter in that book, he examines the whooping crane species survival plan and the particular way that a female whooping crane becomes the source of eggs. Her eggs are constantly removed from her. She is subjected to the incredible intensification of reproductive labor that any female in a species survival plan knows in her flesh. The eggs are then incubated by sandhill cranes and then are imprinted on whooping cranes, but the human laborers will wear whooping crane costumes to keep them from imprinting on humans. And the technicians are building superlight planes to guide the young whooping cranes to a possible habitat, which has been checked out again by sandhill cranes to see if the predator pressure from an area from which they had disappeared is too high to risk bringing very small numbers of animals in a species survival plan back into the zone, into the habitat, so that the sandhill cranes become essentially expendable life to check out the livability for the life with value. The life without value is the sandhill crane. And Tom ends up analyzing the layers of working practices, laboring practices, the labors of value, the labors of freedom and coercion in something that at first glance seemed simply good, holding open space for another. So we asked who lives and who dies and whose kind of holding open what space, the relentless situatedness of the question. Now we can go to the Anthropocene. In about the year 2000, an environmentalist and an atmospheric chemist, Eugene Sturmer and Paul Kreutzen, suggested that we needed a name other than the Holocene for the kinds of geological transformations that were evident in the acidifications of the oceans and the diseases being experienced especially by coral reefs, taking the form often of bleaching, species loss of a really striking kind, and vast areas of bleached reefs and acidified oceans as well as raised temperatures. And that this was part of a much more systematic matter going on Earth that threatened the possibility of the failure of the homeostatic mechanisms of the planetary system itself, such that critters, including the Earth, mortal beings, including the Earth itself, can and do absorb insult after insult after insult after insult to a point at which the narrowing of the possibility of adaptation is such that there's an abrupt system flip. So you can move from a system that like, yeah, it's damaged, but it can take a little more damage. It's recovered before, it'll recover again, just a little more. Add it, and whoosh, you end up with slime and jellyfish. the slime mat in jellyfish, rapid transformation. And then the possibility of remediation or healing or rebuilding the questions of complex multi-species life are of a wholly different order. And the fact of irreversible loss has to be taken in, the impossibility of fixing it. Okay? It's important to remember that there are probably, this is a very low estimate, about 250 human people, not to mention all the not human people, who depend on the reefs for getting through the day. Approximately 250 people in the narrow and tight sense depend directly on the vitality of coral reef systems on this planet to carry on their processes of living and dying well on Earth. The possibility of the disappearance of the reefs in this century is real. Okay. A name for this is proposed by the Geological Society of America Working Group on the Anthropocene will report in the year 2016 about whether this is the term which should actually be adopted to name this transition that will begin. Beginnings are always tough. Sometime, thank you, much nicer. I don't need that anyway. Otherwise mic'd. I knew that already, but I'm very obedient. Whatever you, never mind. The Geological Society of America Working Group will report. Okay, the Anthropocene has quickly been taken up. You can't read the New York Review of Books or the New Yorker, or you can't go to an art show in Berlin, or you can't pick up contemporary work in the sciences or the arts or the humanities or the social sciences without the term Anthropocene coming into your body. It is impossible to exclude the word. And I'm not particularly interested in excluding it, but I am very interested in complicating it. Okay? Now, Bruno Latour, where are we on these pictures? Okay. Bruno Latour, in his Gifford lectures last year in Scotland, was arguing for the importance of the figure of Gaia, G-A-I-A, the figure of Gaia, not as a goddess, but as an it, as a forceful, open system earth figure on which the earthbound must live, and that the earthbound are involved in a war with the humans. And it's the geo stories or the Gaia stories which will inform the earthbound in their great war against the humans who will divide nature and culture, who will once again conduct the project of man. But Bruno argues also for the term Anthropocene, but his anthropos is after the fall of the Tower of Babel. Okay? It's not species man. It's not technological determinism. It is a heteroglot and polyglot after the fall figure. And I share with Bruno this work, but I don't think the term can do it. The Greek roots of anthropos, the one who looks up, the one who looks from below and takes over the power of the gods, the one who is on the tragic itinerary of self-formation, the one who is autopoietic and takes over from the autopoiesis of the earth in the great tragic phallic project of escape velocity and then detumescence in the tragic but really quite deeply desired death of everything. We all know this anthropos very well. We know the stories in our bones. Okay? Now, I would also argue something else as an historian of biology, and if I'm lucky, there is no historian of biology in the room who will tell me that this is truly cheap and dirty, but I can say I actually already know that. However, that said, the new evolutionary synthesis that was put together crudely through the 1920s and 30s that brings together systematics, paleontology, genetics, many other sciences in an extraordinary synthetic explanation of the behavior of genes, individual organisms, populations, species in their great diversity through evolutionary time on this planet. An extraordinary achievement over several decades. But all of those sciences depend on the bounded units defined and described by competition equations derived from the thermodynamics equations of Gibbs and move through the life tables of the insurance companies and the School of Hygiene and Public Health at Johns Hopkins. The great competition equations of the history of mathematics are absolutely critical to the management of the entities crucial to the sciences of the new synthesis. And what the new synthesis could not and did not deal with was embryology, microbiology, and symbiosis. In short, the kind of complexity that I think makes up the geoconjuncture, which is the Earth itself. Okay? Fabulous tools are constructed, and I assure you, in the face of a creationist, I become a new synthesis kind of girl. I was raised in the textbooks that are rewritten according to the new synthesis because of the money made available to do such things after Sputnik, after the Russians beat the United States to space. All kinds of money became available to educate Catholic girls' brains, such as mine, so that my uterus remained quiescent and my brain got a lot of Cold War money. That's why I understand what the Anthropocene is and what its sciences are. Okay? Now, there are other issues. I think that the Anthropocene tends to be somewhat managerial and top-down in its systems imaginations. I think that there are, the name in itself and its stories can't be sloughed off. And furthermore, the damage being done to the Earth is not species damage. It is a specific historical formation. For lack of a better term, let's call it capitalism. It's more than that, and capitalism is not one thing. It's itself an extraordinary sympoetic historical conjuncture, not a closed system. Okay? That said, the Capitalocene not only rests on fossil fuel, it is committed to making as many fossils as fast as possible in the great Burning Man of this notion of history. The arts project of Capitalocene is Burning Man, but of a different kind than one would like to think. So I would urge everybody in this room, whenever you get a chance, to substitute the term Capitalocene in a discussion about the Anthropocene and just see how much weight it can bear. Okay? And I think it can bear rather a lot. Now, there was a systems theorist who works in San Diego in Southern California in an IT corporation who gave a lecture 2 years ago to the Geophysical Union, who argued that from a geophysical point of view, business as usual under the ecological and economic regulations of capital is on the fast track toward extinction and is simply not sustainable even in the midterm, much less the long term. And scientifically speaking, the only imaginable proper course of action is revolt. I think that's kind of a remarkable thing for a geophysicist and IT person to be saying. It got a little press. This is Brad Werner. He's since published a number of papers on the scientific imperative to revolt. We know that the history of science is involved in the history of ethics in quite a number of ways, and you're not supposed to get your ethics from science. Is and not are supposed to be hygienically separated with a diaphragm at least, and so on and so forth. I've never been convinced, and in this case, I've poked a lot of holes in the diaphragm, preceded by Brad Werner. And I think it is indeed the case that truly revolt is the accountable thing to do in the many forms that it takes. That said, I told you at the very beginning that I want to work within figures that I think of as engaged in the practices of partial and finite and mortal flourishing, that somehow give us the figures and stories and sciences that are not simply a counter to that which is threatening to kill us. Secular Gaia, muddy terror, mortal Terrapolis. Watch, I'm not going to be able to say much about any of the pictures that are in front of you right now, except to point out that my favorite one is at the bottom right by a Tlingit artist whose name is Preston Singletary, and it's called Mosquito. I think this is a remarkable reconstitution of the art practices and tropes and materials of Raven and the rest of them. What we have here, obviously, is a series of abyssal and chthonic powers. But I want to say more about the sciences that are emerging among us under a different figure. and it's the gorgones, the gorgons. The one most familiar to people in this room will be Medusa, because Hesiod cleaned her up, and her image ended up on the shield of Athena, that sellout, born from Zeus's head, that head-born traitor to women, who puts the head of Medusa on her shield and makes, and never mind. Clearly, I am not a fan of Athena. Before Medusa was cleaned up, she belongs to a dreadful sisterhood that, for which the term sisterhood is quite wrong. It's a kind of queer before queer, trans before trans, gender of no gender sisterhood that the Gorgons make up, that infected and infused Mesopotamia and these circum-Mediterranean cultures. We know something about the powers that are involved through the Medusa story, because in A Murder for Hire, a little more complicated than that, Athena has Perseus kill her off. And from the blood dripping from her head are born the Gorgones corals of the Western Sea, against which the great explorers of Greek storied heroic travels crash. Okay? So that Medusa's dripping blood produces the corals of the Western Sea. Good for her. And from her decapitated body springs Pegasus. And I assure you that feminists have had stakes in horses for a very long time. The destructiveness and generativity of her body is what I'm calling attention to. And here she is in a 6th century before the current era figuration as the mistress of the animals. This is a Mesopotamian image, a rather late one. But I want now, for just a moment, that is going to be at least as cheap from the point of view of biology as what I did to the new evolutionary synthesis, but more in the mode of joy, as opposed to we need this, but it's unfortunate it was done this way. Namely, and obviously I do this under the auspices of the tentacular ones, the ones whose faces are tentacular. Think what happens to faciality if it's about feelers and tentacularity and its multisensorial modalities. Think of the tentacularity of the cnidarians of the coral reefs with stingers and feelers and chemosensory and light sensors and pressure sensors and the multiple sensorial capacities of the tentacular facialities. How's that? For way too many syllables. So that the terrible face of Medusa that freezes the warrior, the snakes, the feeling snakes, we begin to get a feel again for the stories of the abyssal and elemental ones, the snaky ones, the Ouroboros who sucks on her own tail. The multiple tentacularities, my Pimoa Tulu spider, that is the patron saint of this lecture. We begin to get a sense that this isn't just other critters, but this is us too. Okay? That it is simply not true that we are primarily bipedal hominids with a kind of boring vertebral structure. Well, I mean, it obviously is true, but but that the very possibility of being that at all is a multi-species achievement and a very one that needs to be sustained, just like the goodness of an IT system needs to be sustained. There's a kind of maintenance cost to maintaining critters in these forms. So, I would like to suggest to you that the sciences emerging among us, which I will name after my scientist friends, eco, evo, devo, histo, psycho, techno. Techno-psycho. This isn't quite fair. Ecological, evolutionary, developmental biology is as far as most of my biology friends have been willing to go. But I insist that it's ecological, evolutionary, developmental, historical, technological, psycho, which is my bow to psychoanalysis. The subject, etc. The subject, never mind, not my primary interest. The trans-disciplinarities of the sciences, with biologies playing very leading roles, but not only, have accomplished the following recently. And I do this in front of a painting by Shoshana Devener that was painted in 2012 in honor of Lynn Margulis, and in particularly in memoriam to Lynn Margulis after her death from a stroke. Lynn Margulis is the person who brought among us in exuberant form the sciences of symbiogenesis, which she, many ways in which Lynn invents and collaborates on and makes emerge these sciences, but part of them come from the fact that she read German and some Russian, and she was aware of a 1910 paper by a Russian biologist writing in German who invents the term symbiogenesis. The multiple literacies of Lynn Margulis are an important part of the history of this biology. This particular painting is a painting of the multiple symbiogenetic events that are the origin of the possibility of multicellularity itself. One could safely say that critter eats critter, bacterium eats bacterium, bacteria-type critter eats bacteria-type critter, and gets indigestion, and partially digests, and partially assimilates, but fails to assimilate, and that failed assimilation produces something in the world that truly didn't exist before. That is to say, a kind of congery or collaborative cellularity that emerges with various technological refinements as multicellularity. The biological sciences for the study of the evolutionary emergence of and the many aspects of multicellularity indebted deeply to Lynn Margulis's laboratory are the kinds of understandings of the Earth that the new synthesis simply couldn't deal with. They could happen sort of on the side over in that building. When Richard Dawkins, the great neo-Darwinist, extended phenotype, selfish gene, actually a very smart and interesting man, argues with Lynn Margulis and says, why in the world, when we can explain all of these things with these very elegant equations, let me show you the lovely mathematics of it, why do you mess it all up with this symbiogenetic stuff, all this messy, this and that, you know, and Lynn, who was never not to be defeated by that kind of nonsense, Lynn says, because it's true. Because it is, you know. I like this. Now, in that frame, the animal multicellular, so the complex cellularity is rooted in these kinds of symbiogenetic events, but so too is animal multicellularity. In the laboratory of Nicole King at the University of California, Berkeley, very elegant experiments are going on around the infective events that allow choanoflagellate cells to clump and start behaving like embryos and start being evocative of sponges. And the biomass of sponges is, I forget the exact figure, something like 50% bacterial anyway. And those bacteria are doing things with the sponge cells that the revolutionary event in the evolution of animals, which is animal multicellularity, is enabled by symbiogenetic events between complex eukaryotes and bacteria. Then to developmental partnering. So that developmental unrolling into whatever it is that critters are throughout their lifetime turns out to be a becoming with, not a becoming, a sympoetic sort of engagement, not an autopoetic one. So that organism after organism after organism turns out to need partners to be at all. Okay? So we all know the story that the human digestive system can't, in fact, develop the microvilli properly unless there's the right kind of infection at a proper time and embryonic development and We're beginning to learn that bacterial signaling molecules cross the placenta and turn out to be quite important in the developmental trajectory of the fetus in utero. We have a gorgeous experimental system developed by Margaret McFall-Nye and her students and colleagues of the Hawaiian bobtail squid and its little infectious bacteria. This is really fabulous. The baby squid, those guys on the top left and bottom right. Well, the little crocheted ones are two, but we're not going to think about those. Okay. And the ood, never mind. The baby squid have to be infected by a particular kind of bacteria in a particular time in its developmental trajectory for a certain series of cellular events on the ventral surface of the baby squid to occur in such a way as to form a pouch for bacteria to take up residence, to be light producing, so that the adult squid can look like the starry sky from below, so that it goes hunting at night, and from the point of view of its prey, looking up, it looks like the starry sky and not the one who will have you for dinner. And the squid, meanwhile, will be gluing sand particles to its back, so the ones who would eat it see a sandy bottom. Meanwhile, it's swimming through the sea, having its partnered developmental trajectory. Partnered development is turning out to be the name of the game, is what I'm really saying here. So that a biologist like Scott Gilbert, and not like Scott Gilbert himself, ends up saying, we are all lichens. Lichens and coral are really the model organisms par excellence for the kind of co-becoming that is the general case for life on Earth all the way down in its symbiotic tissues, where the living, non-living boundary turns out to be far from the boundary we thought it was. Scott and his colleagues Jan Sapp in this particular paper and Lawrence Tauber argue that from immunological, anatomical, physiological, neurobiological, evolutionary points of view, you really can't understand your problem if you're thinking in terms of organisms and environments. You really must think in terms of something we may as well call a holobiont, which is a kind of symbiotic provisional entity with porous and layered and palimpsestic and intertwined kinds of boundaries, maintained in various ways, some enduring, some transitory. Temporalities are at stake here, as are spatialities. These aren't just things that go away instantly. These can be quite robust formations. But that entities all the way down are more like holobionts than they are like organisms. That's a rather radical statement. When you find biologists finding that the concept of the organism itself invented in the Anthropocene in relationship to the systems of division of labor and executive function and heat engines of the 19th and 20th centuries. So that the reproductive system, digestive system, locomotory system, neural system, blah, blah system. And then finally the command, control, communications, digitalization of it in World War II, and the heat budgets of it, the way the calorimeters and heat budgets of the world. No wonder that the political economic sciences and the biological sciences have the same conceptual order, the same equations, the same kinds of objects, namely machines, organisms, markets, because they all work exactly the same way based on making fossils as fast as possible, the Capitalocene. Now that's kind of cheap and dirty, so we'll move on quickly. Natasha Myers, who is among us at this moment, and her colleague, Carla Hustak, wrote a paper not very long ago called Involutionary Momentum rather than Evolutionary Momentum. It's a beautiful paper about that rethinks with Darwin, particularly, and particularly around the orchid wasp and orchid bee symbioses, which are usually explained away as zero-sum games or as deception games whereby the orchid tricks the poor hapless male wasp into thinking it's female genitalia to come carry its pollen to some other tricky female to pollinate her, and that the wasp is just constantly tricked. Some other wasp will get a wasp lady, but this boy wasp is just a pollen wagon for the deceptive orchids. Well, Natasha, that's pretty straight, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, it's practically a quotation from these guys. Natasha Myers and Carla Hustak, in an exquisite series of moves, talk about the fundamental, primordial tactile sensory, chemosensory excitability, the unrolling, unfurling, inrolling, the pressures, the momentums toward each other. In the symbiogenetic events I've already described are good instances of that the absolutely fundamental involutionary quality of being excitable tissue. And you can parse that in terms of chemosensory issues and attractions and so forth. You can parse it in a lot of technically very interesting ways. But the fundamental process involved in being the Earth itself is its loquacious partnering. Loquacious partners is one of the terms I will die owing Natasha for, if that's an English sentence. Okay, so, in case I hadn't already, There's one of those lying female genitals writ large, waiting for her bee lover. And I would like to, beauty, by the way, just in case you hadn't already noticed. Beauty is one of the, beauty is no longer forbidden. Beauty has been regarded for so long as a luxury matter, as something you can have after you've done the hard work of real thinking. Even artists. I think of the period in the development of the women's movements and feminist theory in the 1980s where the fear of pleasure, the fear of narrative pleasure drove a kind of abstemious, ascetic practice of stripping pleasure because it was always in the service of the hero moving through matrix space. The stupidity of that is realizable only after somehow we get access again to the absolutely fundamental quality of pleasure in thinking, and indeed in any efforts of any possibility of remediation. Well, look at this cartoon. Is it on screen? Yes. There are these orchids whose flowers look like female bees. When males try to mate with them, they transfer pollen. This orchid, Orpheus apifera, makes flowers, but no bees land on them because the bee it mimics went extinct long ago. Without its partner, the orchid has resorted to self-pollinating, a last-ditch genetic strategy that only delays the inevitable. Nothing of the bee remains, but we know it existed from the shape of the flower. It's an idea of what the female bee looked like to the male bee as interpreted by a plant. Now, as a doctrine of representation, we could do worse. Okay? Wow, say I. Okay? The only memory of the bee is a painting by a dying flower. I'll remember you, your bee, orchid. I'll remember you. Maybe. Involutionary Momentum is a paper about memory and invention and loss and pleasure and many other things. And it's the set of ideas I want to use to make a transition to the third and last part of my paper, which will be much truncated by virtue of having allowed the others to expand beyond their proper bounds. You pays your money, you get what you get. There are, however, 3 art projects which I want to introduce to you in taking up what I think has become necessary to us in these thinking, feeling, loving, suffering, pleasuring worldings that are the sympoetic and symphonic worlds that we need to live in. I start with Beatrice da Costa and her Living and Dying, a title that I gave her work because it's what it gave me, Living and Dying with Companion Species, the interspecies work of Beatrice da Costa, a performance artist and media artist and science studies scholar who died 15 months ago and who left a legacy, a body of work of, I think, great importance that should be taken up and lived with. Her memorial for the still living made use of the conventions of taxidermy and museum display as it is generally applied to those who have vanished. Okay? But Beatrice took it up in a museum in Great Britain with not yet vanished beings, critters, to whom she gave birth dates, which was their moment of description in a Linnaean taxonomy, and death dates, which is their moment of projected extinction, and produced what she hoped in the public was the question of, is this extinction necessary? The effort of the artwork was to open up the space of the possibility of this is not necessary, the critical theoretical insight that the established disorder is not necessary and may yet not be, that it is still just barely possible to open up the spaces of flourishing. And I think Beatrice is an artist who always works with the just barely possible maybe. Okay? The work she did while she was dying of breast cancer, metastatic breast cancer, called Dying for the Other, took up relationships with the laboratory using naked mice in the hospital where she was being treated that was studying breast cancer, and using the mice were workers in the research system. They were laborers in the research system of cancer research. She also engaged in that work with developing dietary issues and cooking and shopping. And there's a lot of kale, a lot of ruffled kale in this show, and also yoga practices. And she puts them together in a triptych. What I want, a 10-minute triptych, which I think is really powerful to watch. But what I want to call your attention to is just one thing, which is the fingery mimesis of these three panels from a screenshot from the show. The fingery hand claw talon of her hand in a yoga posture, the hands of the scientist and the limbs of the mouse in the laboratory, and then the hand and the flower as she's doing exercises to reintegrate hand-eye brain coordination after brain surgery. The multiple mimetic fingery moves that Beatrice is making, I find extremely powerful. She also worked on a project called Pigeon Blog, which I've written about and will really only refer you to, but brought pigeon fanciers, engineers, environmental activists, folks living in a heavily air-polluted neighborhood, and pigeons together to engage in an art project to do real-time monitoring of carbon monoxide and nitrous oxide pollutants at levels at which the official air pollution monitors don't sample, okay? And in areas where they don't sample, but in which pigeons do fly. Okay? So the project is about the work of the men, all men. It's an extraordinary, pigeon fancying is an extremely interesting male practice of love with pigeons, enacted in particular in the Muslim world, but also in working class worlds all over the world. The rooftops of Berlin, where the Turkish immigrants fly their birds. They're illegal in Iran, but tolerated. They're really exuberant in Egypt. They're a big deal in Brooklyn still. The love affairs between men and their racing pigeons is a story told by Colin Gerolmack in The Global Pigeon. That's his book. Anyhow, point being, Beatrice engages with the men of the pigeon fancy and with engineers and air pollution activists to build packs that are comfortable enough for the pigeons that they won't be taken out of the air by an opportunistic recovering peregrine falcon, which, as you know, have begun to flourish in our cities after a long period of endangerment with DDT eggs and the rest of it. In any case, point being, the co-laboring and the co-artistic, co-labor, environmental activist project is what I want to call your attention to. But I want to, the third project that I'll spend a little more time on is the one that Christine and Margaret Wertheim in Los Angeles are engaged in at an institute they founded called the IFF, or the Institute for Figuring, in which they conduct play tanks, not work tanks. And they are interested in, among other things, the sensuality of abstraction. Okay? Now, hyperbolic space, non-Euclidean space, was thought by mathematicians for a long time to be essentially unmodelable in material form. They apparently didn't ever shop for lettuce. Not the salad makers of their family. They could have asked how a perfectly ordinary lettuce plant does it. When I taught biology at the University of Hawaii, I went grocery shopping and I turned over to my undergraduate students a bunch of paring knives and adult vegetables, and I asked them to tell me how they got that way, to give me a plausible developmental sequence for doing form that way through time. Never mind, that was another moment of life. A mathematician at Cornell named, a Latvian mathematician named Daima Taina, crocheted the mathematical models of hyperbolic space that have become critical objects in the history of mathematics, of contemporary mathematics. You can Google these models. And what Margaret and Christine Wertheim did with them is develop a hyperbolic coral reef project in which they took up the question of partnering with the reef systems of the world, with ultimately about 7,000 other people in about 27 projects in about 12 countries. They're currently working with people in Dubai on a crochet coral reef project. And various of the hyperbolic coral reef projects have different kinds of rules attached to them. For example, the one done in Hawaii was about crocheting endemics. This is an area where the xenobiological destruction of the endemics of the Pacific Islands is a very big and terrible story. The rate of introduction and the rate of destruction of endemic Hawaiian species is a really very big deal. And so the rule to crochet endemics was what? Salvage anthropology, another colonial act, an actual act of mourning, a fantasy that never was. What exactly is it? And as you crochet a reef that maybe never existed, but certainly can't, what exactly is happening? What sort of intimacy is being created here? And in all of their projects, they're bringing together women's fiber arts, environmentalism, mathematics, beauty, display, a kind of intimacy without interference, and raising the question of what is still possible in this century when the coral reefs still are with us. Okay? Now, they have developed, this is simply to show what a really interesting social practice it is. It's a collective practice. This one, by Helen Bernasconi, is to show something about the sensuality of abstraction. This particular little critter is so luscious that to understand it as an abstraction, and indeed an embodiment of that kind of abstraction that mathematicians didn't know how to make for a very long time, I think is highly instructive. Okay? But these, on your right, on the top, you will see the toxic reef, one of the toxic reefs that they have engaged in having made. And on the bottom, a piece of the bleached reef, both of which memorialize, engage, bring into presence the damaged reef systems of the world. The only reef systems that they allow to grow indefinitely are the ones made of plastic. You see, you collect plastic bags on the shore, you collect plastic from the grocery store, you get your hands on old reel-to-reel tape, you find thrown away plastic in all of its places, and you crochet the toxic reef in a kind of act of touch with the great Pacific garbage patch, the great gyre, and you understand the ubiquity of plastic in the Capitolocene and the necessity of transformation in the Thulocene. Okay? The bleached reef, which is very fragile and very beautiful, is particularly Christine Wertheim's project, and is crocheted entirely of white wool. The coral forest and installation now involves fantasy figures. You can see both a bleached figure and a fantasy nightmare coral figure that's made mostly of abandoned tape, and that kind of repurposing into nightmares and invitations to ask what responsibility, the cultivation, the rendering capable, what would it take to render each other capable of caring? How do you make caring publics in these kinds of collective projects? My third and last story is actually a storytelling project among Vincent Desprez, a philosopher and psychologist and animal studies person who's become a deep colleague, and Fabrizio Terranova, a filmmaker, and myself from a problem we were set at a workshop, which was to tell a collective story that could somehow take a baby and a baby and a baby and a baby through 5 generations. Implication being it was a human baby and we weren't disobedient enough not to do it that way. So anyhow, we started writing this, echoing this dialogic story. You know, someone writes a part and sends it to someone else, and they write a part and send it to this three-part the syncopated storytelling under the title of The Children of Compost. And I tell this story in front of this panel from a quilting project, which is itself patterned on moss and lichens. And I think brings in Tim Ingold's lines, this question of the multiple linearities of life on Earth and the way that lichens especially, if corals are especially good for tentacularity, I think this quilt makes potent something about the multiple lineaments of the surfaces of rocks. Okay? So we've got Camille. All over the Earth, groups of about 100 people are moving onto damaged land. One group of 100 people moves onto a mountaintop removal site in West Virginia and commits itself to remediating the ruined coal mining land with the people of the valleys and with the inhabitants, multi-species inhabitants of the damaged land. Having a baby, being forced to have a baby is absolutely not permitted. That kind of reproductive freedom is non-negotiable. But having a baby is not a right. It's a community decision. Reproductive freedom consists in the pregnant one deciding who the symbiont of the child will be. Okay? So through a dream, or perhaps through study, or for any number of processes, the one who bears the pregnancy to term joins the born one with a symbiont who is itself a migratory endangered critter, in the case of Camille monarch butterflies, moving between the Kentucky and West Virginia, Ohio summer sites to the overwintering sites in Oaxaca, and moving across the great factory agricultural apparatus of the U.S. Midwest, and their extreme difficulties in all parts of their range. Okay? The job of the Camille's, from generation to generation to generation, is to make it possible for the monarchs to be ongoing. So the technological savvy, the biological savvy, the community building, the reaching out of networks, the sociality of the Camille's will be largely etched by the path of the butterflies. Meanwhile, lots of other kids are being born too, who themselves have paths of migratory critters. So there are various kinds of knots being made. Okay? I'm going to leave, that's just our sort of rules for telling stories. If the monarchs don't make it, if the symbiosis is broken, then the Camille, let's say in the third generation, becomes a speaker for the dead, kind of taking from Orson Scott Card's science fiction, to speak, to collect up the dead in some kind of collective and ritualized way that confronts their actual real death and brings into the present and the future, brings forward their living in a way that allows living and dying to go on, allows flourishing to be possible. For those who lose their symbionts, then bear the burden of being a speaker for the dead. Which then brings us back to recomposing responsibility. Terra's compost, Gaia's posthumous. I'm not posthuman, I'm compost. My partner Rustin said we don't have the future of the humanities once again. We really don't have to participate in that discussion. It's the humusities. That isn't going to work, but you see, you see my problem. I'm actually very serious about saying compost every time I hear the word posthuman. I really don't like the word posthuman. I know it does good work. I get it. I just keep mumbling compost. Okay. And then here again, it matters what thoughts think thoughts. It matters what knowledge is no knowledges. It matters what relations relate relations. It matters what worlds worlds. It matters what stories tell stories. And then go eat a Thulu pie. Okay. Thanks.
I might have to use your mic, Donna.
Oops, that's not a mic.
No,
That's a pointer.
We have a little bit of time to take questions, and let me just check. Are there two mic runners in the back? One over here is Jacques, so he'll look for questions on this side, and we have Christina over here. So, yes, questions.
Okay, can I do one thing before we do questions? Because I actually had another conclusion, but it actually didn't fit aesthetically at that moment. But I would actually like to give it to you anyway, which has to do with this triad of words and my seriousness about the Thulocene or the Thulocene, in that the unfinished Thulocene, it's not just that moment before complex cellularity existed or whatever, it's the ongoingness of possible past, presents, and futures, has to collect up the trash of the Anthropocene the exterminism of the capitalocene, and make a much hotter compost pile for still possible past, presents, and futures. I couldn't have two conclusions, but now you got them both. Okay.
Should I stand up and moderate?
Thank you for a really remarkable, beautiful talk. I came here from a meeting planning the University of Alberta's Leadership Institute, which people in this room will have heard of. Our government is investing $35 million in something to teach our students leadership, which I expect will, if things go in the most predictable way, create some worthy leaders for the capitalocene, people who create fossils as quickly as possible. I'm just wondering if you would engage in this thought experiment with me, if through some freak of corporate recruiting you were given that $35 million and the task of somehow cultivating the sensibility that you've communicated in your talk, what experiences would you want those students to have to break them out of those modes of thought?
Well, wouldn't that be a fun problem to be confronted with? Although, in fact, we do have remarkable resources for doing versions of that even without the $35 million. And I think that the most important thing to do in a classroom and at whatever level is to somehow communicate the permission to engage in SF, to engage in that throwing out a proposition and seeing if it holds, to that trying out knowledges, and that tuning the capability to hear knowledges that are not your own, and to realize that you actually know more than you thought you knew, but you don't know enough to be intelligent yet in this situation. That kind of cultivated, tuned listening and speaking, quiet and moving, and that doing that among various kinds of idioms, knowledges, techniques, that people who believe they're smart are smart. And that kind of guided permission to learning to take up the literacies that are in a classroom and to do something interesting with them. And then to insist that the university structure support those activities so that the students truly can compose in a transdisciplinary way around problems, courses of study from early on, and have the faculty time and the graduate student discussion time and the cultivation of co-learners and co-mentorships that are paid so that people have the time and the space to engage in that kind of trans learning from the get-go, so that the credit system allows that. So you don't get, for example, a faculty member in my institution, if you're going to teach a course with someone else, you only get half a credit for the course instead of a whole credit. So the way we worked around it was to work with the room programmers and just have them accidentally schedule our courses in the same room at the same time. It works. It actually works remarkably well. I've taught several courses that way and gotten full credit. But the questions of struggling for the regulations of time and that money would be seriously dedicated, in my view. I think Marx was quite right that the arrangements of time are really where wealth lies. And that in our university domains, that kind of opening up of time for each other, for our students, for experiment, for exprimer, for the possibility to experience, to express, to know something, to learn languages, to get over the notion that you don't know any mathematics and actually learn some, to be a serious interpreter of literature and being engaged in practice-based learning in all kinds of ways. It's not that mysterious. It's not that we don't know what we want to do, actually. We need to back up the kind of restructuring that all of us are being subjected to various kinds of speed up, various kinds of withdrawal of resources. Our graduate students can't run as many discussion sections. The ones they do run are larger. Our undergraduates finish with more debt because public money is being more and more withdrawn. I mean, this is totally familiar, no mystery to anybody. And it feels like cleaning the toilet to constantly have to work against this. But cleaning the toilet is part of a good life, you know, and then recognizing ourselves as more powerful than we think we are. Simply acting powerful has the really very fine quality of producing power. And joining together with each other, I think, you know, movement people learn this. And making things happen turns out to be easier than we thought, harder than it should be, but easier than we thought. And 35 million would help.
Great. So we have a mic over here, Christina or Jacques?
First of all, I want to echo my thanks. That was a terrific talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I want to ask you a little bit about the status of, let's call them representational models, or the stories that populate your talk, that you started with the Cthulhu and the Medusa as concepts or stories that would reorient our concepts and give us alternatives to our narrative of the Anthropocene. And by the end, I was struck by especially the corals, the crocheted corals, which seem to be less a reorientation of our concepts, but a reflection of something that exists in realistic form, but which we are poised to lose in the future, right? An archive of future loss. And it seemed to me that the story of the corals, or the artistic representation of the corals, was doing something quite a bit different than what you were proposing that we do in the restorying of our concept of the Anthropocene. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit about that, about the status of the artistic form and what it helps you to do to think with that form at the level of your own concepts.
That's interesting. I didn't experience them that way, but I see what you're saying. I think of the corals as not gone, that real damage has been done, and much of that won't be reversible. And the ongoing acidification and heating of the oceans will produce more damage, even if everybody starts behaving themselves by 7 o'clock. You know? That said, this is not a done deal. And I think that, I've talked with Christine and Margaret Wertheim too, the practice of crocheting together and talking with each other as you're making something abstract and beautiful at the same time in relationship to something that you care about flourishing, as well as feel some responsibility for not losing, and that you're in alliance with multi-species alliances with both human and non-human people to make particular reef systems come alive, including fantastic ones as a kind of particularity. I think the nightmare reef systems are every bit as materialist, if you will, as the mimetic reef systems. And I think the crocheting of an abstraction is not representational business as usual. Why do I not experience it that way? I think it's because of I am such a cheap date for beauty. You know, I never wanted to wear black. When every arts person in sight would wear nothing but red and black, I was really not happy. But I think that the engagement in the making of these objects constitutes publics that weren't there before, is a practice of making caring publics invitationally. It's propositional. It's not salvage. It's not salvage crocheting for that which is already dead and we're just memorializing as lost beauty. It's not within that aesthetic, it's not in that story, I don't think. At least not for me.
Any more questions? Right here.
I wonder if you might talk very briefly about something you said at the beginning about staying with the trouble. And you've thrown up a framework here that forces us perhaps to think in terms of how we might escape various ideologies, right? Thinking about the relations that relate relations and so on and so forth. But at the beginning when you spoke of staying with the trouble, you also spoke of it as a method to avoiding despair. Mm-hmm. And as we might try to escape certain ideologies or try to see things in different ways, we often come to see that we just see ourselves in the same place we always were, the Ouroboros and the return.
The wrong kind of Ouroboros, yeah.
Yes. So I wonder if you might speak a little bit more, just to provide me and maybe other people here some clarity about that process in terms of staying with the trouble and how to avoid cynicism and despair as we engage in this process.
I think that what your question indicates, and certainly what I feel, is that the lure of despair, the slough of despond, if we're doing a Pilgrim's Progress, lurks. That it's terribly important to get it, that there is more good stuff going on in this world going on now than we have any idea of, and less than there should be. And that our job is to pay attention and connect and make some things bigger and other things smaller, to cast our lot with some ways of life and not others, with whatever capacities and incapacities we've got. I think the negativities and incapacities are very important in all of this and not bad things. That wherever, whoever is located, there is the work of making live and die well to be done. The work and love of making live and die well. I've done a range of very particular kinds of projects. I've spent time being very interested in the drought erosions of the U.S. Southwest pasture lands and the relationships of Navajo-Churro sheep and Hispano-Anglo-Navajo relations around the history of weaving past, present, and to come, and the revivification of a particular kind of sheep that had been exterminated, but then turns out not to be exterminated again and again and again. The story of the abyssal and elemental ones who would be astralized and disappeared is that, sorry, we're not gone, didn't disappear, and furthermore, we're powerful again. That the paying any attention to Aboriginal and Native and First Nations realities, it's not a story of some kind of happy ending to that was the bad days were then, and the present is all sweetness and light. Far from it. But folks didn't disappear, and are very powerful players. Thank you. And the same thing is true of critters. The kinds of the world is opportunistic. To be a planet of this sort is to be engaged in sympoetic ongoingness of a mortal kind. I think pro-life ideologies of all kinds are lethal. I think they're exterminist, really, and are conducive to really a kind of inattentiveness. So there's no way. Despair, I think, is perhaps a moment that we all go through sometimes. And perhaps I've read novels where people are regarded as, I'm trying to think of, the name is blanking on me. But people in communities are allowed to be kind of in diapause, kind of in a state of arrest, and withdraw, and will be taken care of by their community, and they will come back with other capacities. That various kinds of suffering, including despair, are going to be ours in these situations we're in, and staying with the trouble is a collective practice. And it's a practice of making live and living die in something we might name as possible flourishing. I think I'm a propagandist for not despairing, as opposed to someone who can give reasons for not despairing.
Hi, first I want to say thank you. And I have a question about autopoiesis and symbiosis, and I hope I can articulate it. So I think I understand the argument for symbiosis. But what I'm wondering is if you can speak to boundaries in that system or in a symbiotic system. And the reason I'm curious about that is because I can see the appeal of, and also the reality of that way of defining the organisms, I suppose, or interspecies.
Or what is.
Yeah, what is, okay. But when I think about...
Organisms are autopoietic systems, I would suggest.
So multi-species. But this is why I'm interested in boundaries. I'm interested in... I understand autopoiesis more than symbiosis. The reason I'm interested in boundaries is because, and where they fit in, is because women colonized areas, et cetera, like often experience violent disruptions of boundaries or disrespect of boundaries. So I'm just curious about, so for me, autopoiesis in some ways is appealing, as is symbiosis, which is new to me as of today, but I'm just curious where something like boundaries would fit into that.
Everywhere is the short answer, and that all boundaries should not be infinitely porous. The care and feeding of acts of exclusion, the exclusions are provisional. That does not mean they're necessarily brief or weak. Okay? They're situated, they're important. The violation of exclusions is always the emergence of conflict around questions of who gets access to what, like who owns which stories, or which lineage has the right to move across which land. What kinds of bundles of access will be recognized as property in the courts? How will various kinds of multiple access legal tools be invented out of the history of white settler colonies and Aboriginal resurgence of land claims? What kinds of workable legal property apparatuses can be invented that protect some boundaries, but perhaps not others, perhaps weaken certain kinds of access rights and strengthen others? I think that sympoetic thinking always thinks in terms of not just multi in a general sense, but which partners are at stake here and how, and which contact zones, within which contact zones does who live and die and how. That the questions of whether you're talking about cellular boundaries or intracellular boundaries, or whether you're talking about political boundaries or the integrity of a body, of my body, thank you, against somebody who might grab my breasts on the street in New Haven, as happened as a graduate student. How the hell did he think he had the right to do that? And that was a very mild, incredibly mild form of sexual aggression, hardly even worth mentioning, right? But yeah, of course, it's very much worth mentioning. Anyway, the question of integrity emerges in sympoetic thinking all the time, and it's unfinished. Now, these things are never addressed once and for all. So if I'm telling with Vincent and Fabrizio the story of Camille, the generations of Camille and the children of compost, and if we're really serious that the decision to have a baby is not one's own, that's a rather, I can't tell you with what ire certain feminists in audience have met that suggestion for excellent reason. And then there's the situated character of it all. My little dream of infection rather than reproduction, and of polyparenting rather than integral families and all is all well and good within a history in which the possibility of the getting your family through life is available to you. I mean, these things are situated relentlessly by class and history and need to be talked about that way. So I think of the kind of work that I'm doing not as proposing cases of examples of a general point, but rather trying to specify stories and figures and material semiotic noddings that might or might not be connectable to something else. The question of connections is open in sympoetic thinking as I'm trying to get a grip on it. And we don't work by, give me an example of that, but rather locate me in a world and what kinds of connectivities do and don't, should and shouldn't be nurtured. And for whom? Who decides? There truly is no God trick to be had here. And we are at stake to each other, I think, in both more powerful and more humble ways. At least that's how it's felt to me so far.
Aloha.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you, Donna. It was wonderful. I want to follow on this notion of symbiosis and the camels and the reverence that the camel have for particular kinds of species. And I want to ground it in what is possibly one of the greatest humanitarian agendas at the present time, which is the mobilization of capital generated by widespread human technophilia for objects like little cell phones and Microsoft applications.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to ground it specifically in the agenda of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has as their object at the present moment in time to disrupt the interrelationship of species Plasmodium, species Anopheles, and Homo sapiens sapiens. The idea being to eradicate malaria, which has a multi-millennial relationship to those other two species, us included, and might arguably be Homo sapiens sapiens' number one predator. So I'm really interested in how you speculate on that.
Way to put it. There's so much involved in that. The great accumulations of monopoly capital, of which the Bill and Melinda Gates, and then the elaboration of powerful philanthropic apparatuses that have done immense good in the world, is not an ancient story, but it's an old story. The erosion of public apparatuses, public monies of many kinds, for doing that kind of work, the relative freedom of the so-called, it's not exactly private, but the private foundations called private, the private foundations to circumvent many kinds of, to be relatively friction-free in an international and national context where it's very hard to move, et cetera, et cetera. Under the circumstances, I have no problem with it. Exactly, except that more and more and more of the natural sciences in North America are being funded by giant corporations. On the other hand, we all know perfectly well that the post-World War II, up until the recent past, arrangement of funding was dependent on a permanent war state, and that public funding was essentially war funding, and that I was educated on it. So were a lot of people in this room. I mean, I'm not pick your monster. I also know that if corporations were taxed at anything like an appropriate rate, it would dwarf even the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in terms of the amount of money that would be available for public good. So that the questions of appropriation of wealth produced by labor, says an old fundamentalist Marxist, and not just the labor of people, it remains. You can get, and then there's the question of whether malaria should be made extinct. Well, that kind of depends. What about polio? On and on we go. Although I would truly like something close to the death penalty for the guy that allows the polio workers to somehow become involved in the security in the Osama bin Laden hunt. Give me how many people did he murder as a result of that? But in any case, that's a side. It's not exactly a side story. Public health, the history of public health, and its exterminationist projects is really what you're raising. And what forms of partitioning the earth among species might minimize certain kinds of so-called tropical diseases and infectious diseases with non-exterminationist approaches, right? And what kinds of species associations might minimize the harm that malarial associations would do, and so forth. That whole way of thinking in a more holobiome kind of way, and all of our public health not all of it, but most of our public health thinking has been shaped within exterminationist disease paradigms. And it shouldn't be. I mean, then what a cheap, we have alternatives.
I want to hit pause for a minute. We have time for one, maybe two more questions. So ask yourself if you have a burning question that really needs to come into this room. And while I'm hitting the pause button and you're thinking about that, I want to remind you or inform all of you that there's a public reception immediately after this. So we have time for one or two more public microphoned questions. And then all the questions can continue in the other room with food, drink, Donna, all of us.
If people get me a glass of wine. Only one. I unfortunately don't have a lot of tentacles.
So pause button off. One or two more questions.
Hello. I also want to say thank you for being here, and also that the sign translator must be a genius.
Both of them.
And I do have a question which is short, but the answer might not be. I'm really captivated by the Medusa metaphor, and one can't help but notice that Medusa was a woman.
One can't help, yeah.
Therefore,
Totally accidental in my lecture.
Oh, is it? Oh. Well, okay, that might be the short answer. I am really curious about how you gender the Thulu and what the implications of the feminist Thulu are here.
Well, I even ungendered Medusa when I threw her back to the queer sisterhood of the Gorgones. That she is figured as a female entity all the time. And on the other hand, these abyssal and elemental ones bring kind into question, including the kinds of gender. And so in that sense, to use the already impoverished personal pronouns of English and other languages is a mistake. And to take it literally is a mistake of misplaced concreteness. So in that sense, Medusa is a very problematic kind of figure of mythology. These old tables of the gods that the that the scholars of Bronze Age cultures do, the transmutations of the Gorgon-like figures into both male and female entities is going on all the time. They are mutable in a range of ways in the stories and figurations, and I would like to emphasize that mutability in the chthonic ones.
Last question. Is there a last question? Yeah.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. And you can make this answer as short as you would like so that you can go to wine more quickly. But I wanted to know...
After all, a symbiogenetic product.
Thank you. I wondered if you could just touch for a moment on your really tantalizing quip about being uncomfortable with the post-human and the idea that you would prefer to do compost. And I'm just wondering if that has something to do with the technology, that is to say that the machine will not compost, the machine refuses to turn into humus again. That's it. Thanks.
But machines get repurposed in quite amazing ways, and they do rust and break down depending on what the materials of their metals or plastics or what are. Machines actually do end up getting incorporated. Living and non-living vis-a-vis machines end up being more complicated than that. They do sort of cook. Maybe not in agriculturally interesting compost piles, but I wouldn't rule out the processes of compost in relation to machines. That said, there's no question anybody who wrote this cyborg manifesto is allergic to the term post-human, partly from having been turned out into a blissed out techno bunny by more than one reader, you know. Yes. And also just being I understand that post-humanism and post-feminism are rich and important discourses in which I and many others participate. Many close colleagues and friends like Karen Barad and Rosie Bredati and many other feminist theorists who are close to my heart will describe themselves very happily within those frameworks. So it's not like I want to be completely dismissive. But I do feel that the technological apparatuses that are crusted like barnacles on the term itself, the way in which you constantly have to remind whoever it is that you don't mean post-human that way, you know, that you're not talking about the post-human project of becoming all brain or some such nonsense. That you constantly have to say, no, I don't mean that. And with compost, you sort of have virgin territory. Actually not, you kind of have infected territory. It's not all or none, but it's complicating the languages among us because I'm so relentlessly tuned to the resonances or the barnacles that come crusted with a tool that's handed to me. I just need to scrape them off.
On that note, join with me in thanking Donna for her wonderful talk and poem.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. To food and drink.